Japanese pilots called it fat and slow. They laughed at it. They said it would be easy prey in the skis over the Pacific. But the F6F Hellcat became their worst nightmare, and this is the story of how one plane turned the entire war around. It's 1942. The Pacific War is not going well for America, not well at all. Japanese Zero fighters are cutting through American planes like they're made of paper. Pilots are dying, carriers are sinking, and the United States is losing control of the sky. The Navy needs something fast, something that can fight back, something that can actually beat the Zero. But what they got looked nothing like what anyone expected. The Grumman F6F Hellcat rolled out, and honestly it looked kind of chunky. It was bigger than the Zero, heavier. It didn't look fast or nimble. Japanese intelligence officers got their hands on reports about this new American fighter, and they weren't impressed. Some of them actually laughed. They'd been dominating the skis for years with their Zero, a plane so light and quick it could outturn almost anything in the air. And now the Americans show up with this thick, stocky fighter that looked more like a truck with wings than a killing machine. The Japanese thought they had nothing to worry about. They were wrong, dead wrong. But before we get into how the Hellcat changed everything, we need to understand just how bad things were for American pilots in the early days of the Pacific War. And I mean really bad. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they didn't just surprise America with that one strike. They surprised the world with how good their planes were. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was unlike anything the Allies had seen. It was fast, it could climb like crazy, and it could turn on a dime. American pilots flying F4F Wildcats, the main carrier fighter at the time, quickly realized they were outmatched. The Zero could outturn them, outclimb them, and in a lot of cases, outrun them too. Wildcats were tough little planes, sure. They could take a beating. But in a dogfight against a Zero, toughness only got you so far. If you couldn't shake a Zero off your tail, that toughness just meant you'd be conscious a little longer before you got shot down. Early battles were brutal. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American pilots fought hard, but the Zeros were everywhere, slicing through formations and picking off bombers. At Midway a month later, things went a bit better because of strategy and luck, but American fighters still struggled in one-on-one fights with Zeros. Pilots were getting killed at an alarming rate. The Navy knew they needed something better. The Wildcat just wasn't cutting it. Grumman, the company that made the Wildcat, was already working on a replacement. They'd actually started designing it before the war even began. The original version was called the XF6F1, and it was supposed to be an improved Wildcat. Bigger engine, better performance, that kind of thing. But then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly this wasn't just a peacetime project anymore. This was life or death. The Navy gave Grumman all the information they had on the Zero. Every scrap of intelligence, every pilot report, every combat observation, and Grumman went back to the drawing board. What came out was the XF6F3, the prototype for what would become the Hellcat. And it was chunky, really chunky. It weighed about 9,000 pounds empty. The Zero weighed about 3,700 pounds. Think about that for a second. The Hellcat was more than twice as heavy. It had a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that pumped out 2,000 horsepower. That engine alone weighed more than some entire fighter planes. The wings were thick and strong. The cockpit sat high, giving the pilot great visibility. Everything about it was built tough, built to take punishment, built to keep the pilot alive. But when Japanese intelligence started getting reports about this new fighter, they focused on all the wrong things. They saw the weight. They saw the size. They assumed it would be slow and clumsy. They thought their Zeros would fly circles around it, just like they'd done to every other American fighter. What they didn't understand was that Grumman hadn't tried to beat the Zero at its own game. They'd changed the game entirely. The first Hellcats started reaching Navy squadrons in early 1943. Pilots looked at them and had mixed feelings. Some were excited about the bigger, more powerful plane. Others worried it would be too heavy, too slow. They'd been flying Wildcats, which were small and nimble, And now they were getting this beast of a fighter that felt completely different. But the Navy wasn't just handing them new planes. They were completely changing how American pilots fought. See, up until this point, American pilots had been trying to dogfight with Zeros, turning, twisting, trying to outmaneuver them. And they were losing. The Zero was just too good at that kind of fighting. So the Navy developed new tactics specifically designed for the Hellcat. These tactics played to the Hellcat's strengths and avoided its weaknesses. The main tactic was called the Thatch Weave, named after Commander John Thatch who developed it. But there was more to it than just that. The key was this: never try to turn with a Zero. Never, instead, use speed and altitude. The Hellcat could climb faster than a Zero, it could dive faster, it could take hits that would tear a Zero apart. So the tactic was simple: get above the enemy, dive down fast, take your shot. And if you miss, don't stick around trying to turn and fight. Use that big powerful engine to climb back up, get altitude again, and set up another attack. Hit and run, boom and zoom, use your strengths. There was another huge advantage the Hellcat had: armor, lots of it. The Zero was fast and nimble because it was light, and it was light because it had almost no armor protecting the pilot. A few good hits and a Zero would catch fire or fall apart. The Hellcat was the opposite. It had armor plating behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode if they got hit. The cockpit glass was thick. The whole plane was designed with one idea in mind: keep the pilot alive. Even if the plane got shot up, even if it was barely flying, it would get the pilot home. And this mattered more than anyone realized at first. Because yes, in a perfect world you'd never get hit. But this wasn't a perfect world. This was war. Bullets were flying everywhere. Even the best pilots got hit sometimes. And in a Zero, getting hit often meant you were dead. In a Hellcat, getting hit meant you'd probably survive, fly home, and be back in the air the next day. The Japanese could shoot down a Hellcat, and the next week that same pilot would be back, more experienced, more dangerous. They could shoot down a Zero, and that pilot was usually gone forever, along with all his training and experience. The Hellcat first saw combat on August 31, 1943, during a raid on Marcus Island. It was a small operation, just a test really, but the results were promising. The Hellcats performed well. Pilots liked them. A few weeks later came the real test: the raids on Wake Island in October 1943. This was a heavily defended Japanese base, and there would be plenty of Zeros in the air. American commanders were nervous. This would prove whether the Hellcat was really as good as they hoped, or whether it was just another plane that would get torn apart by Zeros. The Hellcats launched from their carriers and headed toward Wake Island. As they approached, Japanese Zeros scrambled to meet them. The two forces crashed together in the sky over the island, and something remarkable happened. The Hellcats didn't just hold their own. They dominated. Pilots used their new tactics perfectly. They stayed fast, stayed high, dove in for attacks, and then climbed away before the Zeros could turn on them. When Zeros tried to follow them up, the Hellcats outclimbed them. When Zeros tried to run, the Hellcats were faster in level flight. And when bullets hit the Hellcats, they just kept flying. At the end of the battle, the score was lopsided. Really lopsided. American pilots claimed dozens of Zeros shot down. They lost only a handful of Hellcats, and most of those pilots survived. The Navy brass couldn't believe the reports at first. They thought pilots were exaggerating. But raid after raid, battle after battle, the same pattern kept showing up. Hellcats were destroying Zeros at rates no one had thought possible. By late 1943, the Hellcat was proving itself again and again. At Tarawa in November, Hellcats dominated the skies while Marines fought on the ground below. During the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns, Zeros started avoiding fights with Hellcats when they could. Japanese pilots were starting to realize this American fighter was different. It was dangerous. But the Japanese military had a problem. They couldn't just switch to a new fighter plane overnight. They'd invested everything in the Zero. Their tactics, their training, their entire air war strategy was built around it. And the Zero had worked so well for so long. It had given them control of the Pacific for years. Changing now would mean admitting they'd been beaten, and that wasn't something the Japanese command structure handled well. So they stuck with the Zero and tried to make it work. They modified it, tried to add more power, more speed. But every change made it heavier, and being light was the Zero's whole advantage. They were stuck. Meanwhile, more and more Hellcats were reaching the Pacific. By early 1944, they were everywhere. Every carrier had them. Every island base with American forces had them. The Navy was pumping them out as fast as Grumman could build them. And Grumman was building them fast. The factory in Bethpage, New York, was running around the clock. Workers were building Hellcats in massive numbers. At peak production, they were finishing one Hellcat every hour. Every single hour. Think about that. By the time you finish watching this video, back in 1944, another Hellcat would have rolled off the assembly line, ready for war. But numbers alone don't win wars. What really mattered was how those Hellcats were being used. And by 1944, American pilots had turned fighting Zeros into a science. They knew exactly what to do. If you spot Zeros below you, dive on them fast. Get a quick burst of gunfire in and keep going. Don't slow down, don't try to turn. Just blow through and climb back up. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't try to out-turn it. Push the throttle forward and go straight. The Hellcat is faster. The Zero can't keep up. Once you've got distance, climb, turn around, and now you're the hunter again. If you're with your wingman, use the thatch weave. When a Zero chases one of you, the other turns in and shoots it. Work together, protect each other. Never fight alone if you can help it. These tactics were drilled into every Hellcat pilot until they became second nature. And they worked. By God, they worked. Japanese pilots who'd been flying for years, who had dozens of kills, were getting shot down by American pilots who'd been flying Hellcats for months. The experience gap didn't matter as much anymore because the Hellcat was just that much better. And because American pilots who got shot down often survived and came back, while Japanese pilots who got shot down usually died. Then came June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This was going to be the biggest carrier battle since Midway 2 years earlier. The Japanese had gathered their remaining carrier fleet for one massive attack. They were going to strike the American carriers and turn the tide of the war. That was the plan. The Japanese launched hundreds of planes, Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, everything they had. American radar picked them up coming in. The carriers scrambled every Hellcat they could get in the air. Over 450 Hellcats launched and formed up between the Japanese attack and the American fleet. What happened next became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and that nickname tells you everything you need to know. The Hellcats tore through the Japanese formation like a chainsaw through paper. Japanese pilots who'd been confident, who'd been told they were the best in the world, found themselves completely outmatched. Hellcats came at them from above, from the sides, from angles they couldn't defend against. The American pilots worked in pairs and groups, covering each other, setting up perfect attacks. Japanese planes started falling out of the sky in huge numbers. Zeros that tried to fight back couldn't land hits on the tough, armored Hellcats, and when they did, the Hellcats kept flying. Bombers trying to get through to the carriers were getting picked off left and right. Some Japanese pilots panicked. Some tried to run. It didn't matter. The Hellcats hunted them all down. By the end of that first day, the Japanese had lost over 300 planes. 300. The Americans lost about 30. Let that sink in. 10-1. The Japanese couldn't sustain losses like that. They didn't have enough trained pilots. They didn't have enough planes. The whole reason they'd launched this attack was to try to stop the American advance, and instead, they just destroyed their own air power. American pilots landed back on their carriers almost giddy. Some of them had shot down 4, 5, 6 planes each in a single day. The Japanese fleet retreated broken. They'd never recover from this. The Philippine Sea wasn't just a battle. It was a slaughter. And the F6F Hellcat was the weapon that made it happen. But the Hellcat wasn't done yet. Not even close. Over the next year, as America pushed closer and closer to Japan, the Hellcat was there for every battle. At Iwo Jima, Hellcats controlled the skis while Marines died on the beaches below. At Okinawa, Hellcats shot down kamikaze planes before they could hit American ships. The Japanese had started using suicide tactics because they couldn't win regular fights anymore. Think about that. They were so outmatched that crashing their planes into ships seemed like the better option. And even then, Hellcats were stopping them. By this point in the war, finding experienced Japanese pilots was rare. Most of them were dead. The pilots flying Zeros now were often kids with barely any training. Some of them had less than 100 hours of flight time before they were sent into combat. American Hellcat pilots, meanwhile, were getting better and better. They had more experience, better training, and they were flying a plane that was superior in almost every way that mattered in combat. The kill ratio kept climbing. For every Hellcat lost in air combat, American pilots were shooting down 19 Japanese planes. 19-1. That's not a battle, that's complete and total air supremacy. Japanese commanders knew they were beaten in the air. They knew it, but what could they do? They didn't have time to design and build a new fighter that could compete. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the fuel, they didn't have the trained pilots. So they kept sending up Zeros, and American Hellcats kept shooting them down. Some historians argue the Hellcat won the air war in the Pacific almost single-handedly, and looking at the numbers, it's hard to disagree. The Hellcat was credited with destroying over 5,200 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter, more than the famous P-51 Mustang, more than the British Spitfire. The Hellcat killed more enemy planes than any other fighter in history. And it did it in just 3 years. But what made the Hellcat so successful wasn't just the plane itself. It was everything around it, the tactics, the training, the fact that it was designed specifically to counter the Zero, using actual combat data instead of guesses, the fact that it kept American pilots alive so they got more experienced instead of dying in their first few fights, the fact that America could build them faster than Japan could shoot them down. It was a system, a whole system designed to win, and it did. The Japanese had mocked the Hellcat when they first heard about it. They'd called it slow and fat. They'd thought it would be easy prey. But in the end, the hunters became the hunted. Zeros started fleeing when they saw Hellcats coming. Japanese pilots who'd once been confident became scared. Some of them wrote letters home talking about the American Grumman fighters, how tough they were, how deadly. They stopped laughing real quick. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat had completely rewritten what naval aviation could do. It had turned the tide in the Pacific. It had avenged Pearl Harbor and all those early defeats, and it had done it while keeping more American pilots alive than any other fighter. After the war, when everything was analyzed and all the combat reports were studied, the numbers were staggering. In air-to-air combat, Hellcats had achieved a kill ratio of 19-1. For every Hellcat shot down, 19 enemy planes were destroyed. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air combat during the entire war. Compare that to the thousands of enemy planes they destroyed, and you start to understand just how one-sided this became. The Hellcat was so successful that some Navy pilots called it their life insurance policy, and they meant it. Pilots trusted this plane with their lives because it had earned that trust in hundreds of battles. There are stories of Hellcats coming back to carriers with massive damage, holes in the wings, pieces of the tail blown off, engines smoking and barely running, and they still made it home. One famous story involves a pilot named Alex Vrasiu. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the same Turkey shoot we talked about earlier, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese planes in one mission. 6, in about 8 minutes. That's less time than a couple songs on the radio. He came back and landed on his carrier, and his gun cameras confirmed every single kill. The Navy loved the Hellcat. Pilots loved it. Even the Marines started using it from land bases, and they loved it too. It was reliable, it was tough, it was deadly, and it brought people home. Now let's talk about why the Hellcat worked when so many other planes didn't. Because there were other American fighters in the Pacific. The P-38 Lightning was there. The P-47 Thunderbolt showed up later. Even the famous P-51 Mustang saw some action in the Pacific theater, but none of them had the impact the Hellcat did. Why? First, the Hellcat was designed from day one to operate from aircraft carriers. That's harder than it sounds. Carrier planes need strong landing gear because they're slamming down onto a moving deck. They need folding wings so they can fit in the tight spaces below deck. They need to be able to take off in short distances because carrier decks aren't that long. The Hellcat did all of this perfectly. It was easy to land, which meant less accidents. It was easy to maintain, which meant more planes in the air. Navy deck crews could rearm and refuel a Hellcat fast, getting it back in the air for another mission quickly. The Army fighters like the P-51 were amazing planes, don't get me wrong, but they were designed for land bases with long runways and full maintenance facilities. You couldn't operate them from carriers effectively. And in the Pacific War, carriers were everything. The battles were happening thousands of miles from the nearest American land base. If you couldn't operate from a carrier, you couldn't be where the fighting was. Second, the Hellcat was designed with input from pilots who'd actually fought Zeros. Grumman didn't just guess what would work. They talked to guys who'd been in combat, guys who'd barely survived fights with Zeros, guys who knew exactly what they needed. Those pilots said they needed better visibility, so Grumman raised the cockpit. They said they needed more protection, so Grumman added armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. They said they needed more power, so Grumman put in that massive R2800 engine. Every decision was based on real combat experience, not theory. Third, the Hellcat was reliable. It didn't break down constantly. It didn't have weird quirks that could get you killed. Some fighters were faster or could turn better, but they were temperamental. They'd overheat or the engine would quit at the wrong moment. The Hellcat just worked. Every time. You started it up and it ran. You pushed it hard and it kept going. You brought it back full of holes, and the maintenance crew could patch it up and have it ready for the next day. That reliability meant more planes in the air more often, which meant more pressure on the Japanese. Fourth, and this is important, the Hellcat made average pilots good and good pilots great. Not every fighter pilot is a natural ace. Most of them are just regular guys trying to do their job and survive. The Hellcat was forgiving enough that average pilots could fly it effectively and still have a good chance of surviving combat. It didn't require perfect skill to stay alive. At the same time, in the hands of a truly skilled pilot, the Hellcat was a monster. The top Hellcat ace, Commander David McCampbell, shot down 34 enemy planes. In one single mission, he shot down 9 planes in one flight. That's almost impossible to even imagine. But he did it because the Hellcat gave him the tools he needed: speed, firepower, toughness, and reliability. Another thing that doesn't get talked about enough is the Hellcat's guns. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Those guns had a lot of ammunition, and .50 cal rounds were no joke. They could tear through a Zero's thin skin like it wasn't even there. One good burst from a Hellcat could shred an enemy plane. Pilots didn't need to score a perfect hit. They just needed to get close and pull the trigger. The sheer volume of fire would do the rest. Some Hellcats were modified to carry rockets or bombs for ground attack missions too. So when there weren't enemy planes to shoot down, Hellcats could strike ground targets, destroy buildings, blow up fuel depots, whatever was needed. It was versatile. You could use it for anything. Let's go back to the Japanese side for a minute, because understanding why they lost helps explain why the Hellcat won. The Zero had been designed in the late 1930s. By 1943, it was already outdated. But Japan didn't have the industrial capacity to just design and build a completely new fighter. They tried. They made modified versions of the Zero with more powerful engines. They designed new planes like the Shiden and the Raiden. But these programs were slow, plagued with problems, and never produced enough planes to matter. Meanwhile, America was pumping out Hellcats by the thousands. Japan also had a huge problem with pilot training. Early in the war, Japanese pilots were incredibly well trained. They had years of experience. They'd been fighting in China since the 1930s. But as these experienced pilots got killed, there was no good system to replace them. Japan didn't have enough fuel to properly train new pilots. They didn't have enough time, so they'd give new pilots some basic training and then send them into combat where most of them died quickly. America, on the other hand, had a massive pilot training program. They could afford to give pilots hundreds of hours of training before sending them to combat. They had fuel. They had instructors. They had time. So American pilots kept getting better on average, while Japanese pilots kept getting worse. By 1945, some Japanese pilots were so inexperienced they could barely fly their planes, let alone fight in them. There are reports of Japanese pilots getting lost and running out of fuel, or crashing while trying to land, or making basic mistakes that got them killed before they even saw an American plane. It was sad in a way. These were young kids sent up in outdated planes with almost no training to face experienced American pilots in superior fighters. The outcome was never in doubt, but Japan kept sending them anyway because they didn't have any other choice. The war was lost, but they kept fighting, and the Hellcats kept shooting them down. One of the most telling statistics is this. By the end of the war, the average American fighter pilot had about 600 hours of flight time before entering combat. The average Japanese pilot had about 100. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between someone who really knows how to fly and fight, and someone who's barely figured out how to take off and land. Combine that experience gap with the fact that the Hellcat was just a better plane than the Zero for the kind of fighting that was happening, and you get those 19-to-1 kill ratios. It wasn't even fair. Some people argue that the Hellcat wasn't actually that special, that it just had numbers on its side. There's some truth to that. America did have more planes, more pilots, more everything. But numbers alone don't explain 19-to-1 kill ratios. You don't achieve that just by showing up with more planes. You achieve that by having better planes, better pilots, better tactics, and better support systems. All of those things together. The Hellcat was the right plane at the right time, designed for exactly the war it ended up fighting. If the Pacific War had been different, if it had been fought over land with long runways and no carriers, maybe the Hellcat wouldn't have mattered as much. But the war was what it was, and the Hellcat was perfect for it. There's also something to be said about the psychological impact. After a while, Japanese pilots knew that if they saw Hellcats, they were probably going to die. That fear affects how you fight. It makes you hesitant. It makes you make mistakes. Meanwhile, American pilots in Hellcats felt confident. They knew their plane could take hits. They knew they could outrun Zeros if things went bad. That confidence made them aggressive, and aggression wins fights. By the time the war ended, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built. They served on every American carrier in the Pacific. They flew from island bases across the theater. Some were even given to the British Royal Navy, who used them in the Atlantic and Pacific. After the war ended, the Hellcat was retired pretty quickly. Jet fighters were coming, and the age of propeller-driven fighters was ending. But the Hellcat had done its job. It had won the air war. It had protected the fleet. It had killed the Zero's reputation and dominance. If you look at memorials and museums today, you'll find Hellcats preserved and honored. There's one at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. There's one at the Smithsonian. These planes are remembered not just as machines, but as the tools that helped win the Pacific War. Veterans who flew them still talk about the Hellcat with respect and affection. They trusted it. It saved their lives. And in war, that's everything. So what's the lesson here? What can we learn from the story of the Hellcat? Maybe it's this. Sometimes the thing that looks less impressive on paper turns out to be exactly what you need in reality. The Zero looked better on paper in a lot of ways. It was lighter, more maneuverable, faster in some situations. But in actual combat under real conditions, the Hellcat was better, because it was designed for reality, not for looking good in a specification sheet. The Hellcat wasn't trying to be the fastest or the most agile. It was trying to keep pilots alive and kill enemy planes, and it did both better than anything else. Another lesson is the importance of learning from experience and adapting. The early American fighters in the Pacific weren't good enough, so America didn't just keep building them and hopping for the best. They studied what was going wrong. They talked to pilots. They designed something better. They changed tactics. They adapted. The Japanese, on the other hand, stuck with what had worked before, even when it stopped working. They couldn't adapt fast enough, and it cost them everything. There's also something here about the value of protecting your people. The Hellcat was heavier and less maneuverable, partly because it had all that armor and protection. That weight was a trade-off, but it was the right trade-off because it kept pilots alive, and experienced pilots are worth more than a slightly faster plane. Japan sacrificed pilot protection for performance, and they paid for it with a generation of dead pilots. America protected their pilots, and those pilots got better and deadlier over time. It's a reminder that in the long run, keeping your people alive and capable is more important than short-term performance gains. When you look at the whole picture of the Pacific War, the Hellcat stands out as one of the most important weapons America had. Not tanks or battleships or bombs, but this one carrier fighter that changed everything. It turned the tables on Japan's air power. It protected the fleet. It supported invasions. It hunted down enemy planes relentlessly until there were none left. And it did all of this while being mocked at first. The Japanese called it fat and slow. They thought it would be easy. They were wrong. And by the time they realized how wrong they were, it was too late. The Hellcat was everywhere, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. So yeah, the F6F Hellcat. A plane that didn't look like much at first glance. A plane that got laughed at by the enemy. A plane that turned out to be one of the most lethal fighters in history. Over 5,200 enemy planes destroyed. A 19-to-1 kill ratio. 3 years of complete air dominance. And thousands of American pilots who came home because their Hellcat kept them alive when it mattered most. That's the story of how one chunky, tough, powerful fighter changed the entire Pacific War. The Zero had ruled the skis for years, but the Hellcat ended that rule permanently. And it did it so thoroughly that by the end, Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat more than anything else in the sky. The hunters became the hunted. The mockers became the defeated. And the fat, slow American fighter that supposedly didn't stand a chance became the most successful naval fighter in history. That's not just a comeback story. That's complete and total domination. And that's why the F6F Hellcat deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest fighters ever built. Check out what happened when American bombers faced Japanese fighters next.